Is it the Supreme Court's job to push America onto the right side of history? Let me give you four cases. The most recent is Bostock. This is a case where transgender people cannot be discriminated against. Obergefell, a recent case, said gay marriage is acceptable. Roe v. Wade and Griswold versus Connecticut, two different cases that say women can control their reproduction. And Brown versus the Board of Education, of course, that says that black folk should be integrated in schools. Now, if you said, yes, Mr. Warren, all those are so good things, and the Supreme Court had to do them, I'm going to disagree with you. But before I disagree with you, let me read you something that agrees with you. This is a recent Atlantic article about a Supreme Court Barrett. So this is them talking about what an originalist says. So listen to this. The court must interpret and apply the terms of the Constitution according to their plain meaning, where there is plain meaning, and understanding and intent of the framers where there was such a thing. And this is not what originalist says. This is what the more activist court says. But it must also recognize that our understanding of our principles and values has expanded over time. And it must interpret the law in the context of that growth, so that there's something happening in American society, and that change, the Supreme Court has to follow that change. And then listen to this. The real problem with the originalist theory is that it allows no room for ethical, moral, or political growth. If the framers didn't think it, it's not allowed. Now, this is such bunkum. Because, first thing, it's not if the framers didn't think it, it's not allowed. The framers didn't think about giving the right to black people to vote or to be citizens, or for women to vote. Those are all things that we amended the Constitution. The Constitution has ability to grow, but it's also the idea that as it says, the only way we can change our understanding of principles and values is through the Supreme Court. Now, I want you to read, this is a wonderful dissent. I used to make my kids read this every year. Little did they know that I was trying to turn them into originalists. This is there was a case called Griswold versus Connecticut. Connecticut had a law, an old-fashioned law, that said no one, not even married couples, could buy contraceptives. How ridiculous that is, and how offensive that is. And so the Supreme Court said, well, we're going to stop that. We're going to stop that business. And listen to the dissent. The guy who disagrees with that, listen to what he says. This is Justice Black dissenting. So understand, this is not part of Griswold versus Connecticut, but I love the dissents. The small letters, I'm sorry, I'll read it aloud to you. The law is every bit as offensive to me as it is to my brethren, who, reciting reasons why it is offensive to them, hold it unconstitutional. But I cannot subscribe to their conclusion that the evil qualities they see in the law make it constitutional. Just because a law is evil or even unjust doesn't mean that the Supreme Court can overrule it. That's what he's saying. Listen again. If due process formulas based on natural justice are to prevail, they require judges to determine what is or not constitutional on the basis of their own appraisal of what laws are unwise or unnecessary. And that's what she said in the Atlantic article, which I'll post here. She said the things are changing, right? Her exact words were, our understanding of and principles and values have expanded over time, and it must interpret the laws in the content of that growth. It allows no room for ethical, moral, or political growth. And the answer is, of course, we do. It's just not the Supreme Court that does it. Listen to what he finishes saying. The power of, and this is the most important part, the power to make such decisions is, of course, that of a legislative body. I do not believe that we are granted power to measure constitutionality by the belief that the legislation is arbitrary, capricious, unreasonable, or accomplishes no justifiable purposes, or is offensive to our own notions of civilized standards of conduct. If you want to change the laws, then have the legislatures change the laws. Now, the problem is, of course, Brown versus Board of Education. And originalists always seem to squirm when we mention this, and I wouldn't squirm. I would just say, look, we now know that Brown versus Board of Education was so important. It was such an excellent thing to happen to America, because without Brown versus Board of Education, I can't imagine the civil rights movement working as well as it did. The civil rights movement needed a federal injunction to help it move, and Martin Luther King used federal governments all the time. Remember the Selma story, when they marched over Selma and got beaten up, and then they were going to do it again. Well, they were going to do it one day, and the federal court did not give them the right to do it. So Martin Luther King called it off that day, and people were very angry at him. But he knew how to use the federal court system. And so in the end, think about this, in the end, though Brown versus Board of Education started the civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the legislative decision that finally makes things work. Because remember, even in 66 or 67, there were still some high schools that were not integrated. That work didn't really, the Brown versus Board of Education didn't really finish until after 65, 66. And if you say, well, Mr. Horn, Brown versus Board of Education shows that you have to do this, I'll say no. Brown versus Board of Education was an outlier. It wasn't something we should not do again. It was a time of importance, and if you look at the story, Earl Warren gets onto the Supreme Court. He's not a judge. He's a governor of California, a Republican governor of California, appointed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who, by the way, Dwight D. Eisenhower was no radical integrationist who wanted this. He didn't really want all the problems that were going to come with Brown versus Board of Education. But Earl Warren comes in, and Earl Warren says, hey guys, look, to heck with the Constitution, to heck with judicial stuff. We've got to do this. We, as the Supreme Court, we're the ones who are going to have to do this. The nation's not going to do this. This is something that has to be done, and we're going to do it. And guess what? They do it 9-0. One more time. Brown versus Board of Education, 9, because he goes, I don't want 8-1. This has got to be a slam dunk. And the people who signed off on that were not happy. They didn't think it was right. They didn't think it was constitutionally proper. But they signed off on it because it was an emergency. It was a moment of great emergency. Now the problem is when you get to Griswold versus Connecticut, and we're talking about contraceptives in Connecticut? Seriously? Is that a great emergency? I don't think so. And when we get to Roe v. Wade, this is where we really start to have troubles, because I'm going to say in 1972, we should, as a nation, have thrashed out this question of abortion. I promise you, by today, things would have been a bit better. Not everyone would be on board, but we would have had to find a compromise, and there wouldn't be this almost impossible to solve problem between pro-life and pro-choice people. The reason we have that is because the Supreme Court took a question that should have been answered by the people through their representatives and pulled it out of the arena. Now, I'll say the same question with the Obergefell. Gay marriage, states were coming around to it. By the way, remember, California voted against gay marriage, and I can't remember the date, but it was in the last 25 years. Remember that Obama was elected in 2008 in part because he says to one of the biggest churches in California, I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, he didn't say, I also believe that gay people can get married, which is what he believed, but he didn't say that. And though he wanted that, it was never passed. But my thoughts, I think we could have used another 20 years of arguing things over. To be honest with you, I don't think gay marriage is going to be that big of a deal, but oh my gosh, if you think that Americans have accepted transgenderism and that have accepted the fact that, well, it's not a fact, by the way, but have accepted the so-called fact that there is no such thing as men and women, that there are simply things that people choose. Americans are not buying that. That's going to come back and bite you, I'm telling you. And the question again is, even if that's true, then let's hash it out. Hash it out in Congress. Hash it out in the Senate. Hash it out in the states. If you have the Supreme Court doing this, if you have the Supreme Court making important legislative decisions, guess what happens every time there's a Supreme Court justice nominated? That'll be terrible. Now, I've gone way over my time, so I'll talk about in number 2 why I think that the right to bear arms is not a constitutional right. I don't think you should have guns. I think that's an originalist position. We'll come back in the next episode.